Welcome back. Now joining us in the studio now is Firdaos Rosli, a fellow in economics from the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia. So hi Firdaos, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for
having me. A lot to talk about today. First question, overall, what are your thoughts on the recalibrated budget?
First of all, should make it clear that it's not necessary for the government to recalibrate the budget, simply because that government can still function at the current economic scenario, with the current oil price, with the current exchange rate, and it's fine. But I think, in my opinion, that the government is undertaking such measure, the 11 measures that was announced by the Prime Minister this morning, with a view that the government has to look into the future, and this will have to take into account the long-term prospects of the national accounts. So the government is still putting the targets as what it was earlier, such as the fiscal deficit still fixed at 3.1%, the federal budget still fixed at 55% and below of GDP, inflation rate still being capped, still being controlled by the government to some extent, as well as the GDP growth of 4 to 4.5%.
With that in mind, what do you think was the main consideration in recalibrating the budget?
I think there are three aspects that I could think of at the moment. One is that the impact of the on the federal revenue as a result of the downfall in oil price. As we all know, that the oil price was, or rather the budget was formulated at 48% or 48 US dollar per barrel, and now it has gone down to 32, 31 US dollar per barrel. So the government has announced that the new budget, or rather the calibrated budget, is now being fixed at 30 to 35 US dollar per barrel, and that will give some form of idea where the spending should be focused on. That's number one. Number two is the exchange rate. I think the government is trying to limit the exposure, or rather the pressure on the domestic economy as a result of the forex exchange over the last 18-19 months. And that is probably the second biggest consideration that the government has to take into account. And with all these two factors forming into play, then how does these two factors translate into the domestic economy, whereby there is an external pressure as a result of these two, and also there is an internal pressure as a result of increase in inflation over the last 1 year or so, due to GST partly, and also due to other factors such as the dependence on imported goods into the economy.
Now, Firdaos, let's go to an issue that directly impacts the rakyat. Now, one of the measures announced is that new homes priced under 300,000 ringgit will now be limited to first-time house buyers only. Now, what's your take on this?
I think, firstly, the cap of 300,000, we have to detail them into a greater extent, simply because, from my own observation, I think house prices within this range are usually not situated in economic centres, i.e., it will probably be at a greater distance than a place of work. So for first-time homeowners, they will probably want to look at something that is more convenient, something that is accessible, or something that will make them even mobile in the current economic scenario. So, to ascertain the impact of that step is probably going to take a little bit more research, in my opinion. But it does, however, address some element of speculation. But I think that's probably negligible at this point of time.
Okay. Now, on the line to give us more insight on this, we actually have Asian Strategy and Leadership Institute ASLI Chief Operating Officer Ng Yeen Seen. So, hi, Yeen Seen. Do you think limiting houses priced below 300,000 ringgit will impact the property market and developers?
Sorry, can you please repeat your question?
Yeen Seen, do you think that limiting prices, houses priced below 300,000 ringgit will impact the property market and developers?
Hi. Oh, okay. First thing first, I think it's important for us to recognize that there are not many houses available in KL, Selangor, Seremban, and even Penang at the price of below 300,000. So technically, it is not going to impact the property market much because, to be honest with you, the cost of building today is very high. So for people who can afford to purchase 300,000, to purchase houses below 300,000, most of them would be first-time owners anyway. And the choices that hello.
Yep, can
Hello?
hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, it's very noisy.
Yeah. Hello. Keep going.
Yeah. Okay. So what I want to say is that for people who can afford houses at prices with 300,000 and below, number one is that they won't have much choices to begin with, and that there are not many houses like that in the market. So it will not impact the property market a lot, and it's definitely not going to impact the developers, because developers who build houses at the price of 300,000 and below, they are of a different category of property developers anyway. And for property developers who build houses at above 300,000 and above, they are not going to be the same people building houses at the rate of 300,000 and below.
Now, Yeen Seen, another initiative to stimulate the economy is reducing the employees' EPF contribution. What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, for people who earn not much, perhaps those who earn below 5,000 ringgit with a take-home pay of maybe 4,000 over, 3% of their EPF contribution would mean that they will have more purchasing power because they will suddenly have a little bit more disposable income. However, if they don't save on this 3% or they don't invest, then in the long run, it may not be a good measure. However, to tackle the immediate rising cost of living and to put food on the table, the 3% may be helpful in the short term.
Okay, thanks, Yeen Seen, for that
Thank
feedback.
you.
Now, Bank Negara also commented on the matter with Governor Tan Sri Dr. Zeti Akhtar Aziz saying the reduction measure was to boost domestic demand.
We have already detected some moderation in domestic demand. Very key is supporting domestic demand. And this means consumption demand. That is the most significant component. So what needs to happen is putting money in the hands of consumers, and this is done through income transfers and now through this EPF. Of course, savings for retirement is very, very vital. Therefore, this kind of measure is very temporary.
Now, Firdaos, what's your take on this?
I would like to pick up her last point, temporary. It is the 3% should be temporary because, it does create some kind of relief for salary earners, simply because now you have an additional 3% into your pocket rather than before. But then again, that measure is temporary. What we should focus on is to have some form of initiative or some form of policy that would make it more sustainable in a way for us to tackle the rising cost of living and to address the cost of rising prices of goods that we experience today is not entirely unexpected, because in all countries that introduced the GST, for example, there is a marked increase in the CPI, and we have seen this in all countries. But that's normal, and we are not accepted. There's no exclusion here. So yes, we can introduce some form of policy to boost domestic demand, as what Tan Sri was saying, but also there are the other segment of the society that can also play a role. For example, consumer associations. where they can be the catalyst to push, or rather to create some kind of pressure in order to limit companies from continue being having supernormal profits. We cannot depend totally on the part of government, because the government has to regulate, the government has to govern. Yeah, that's true. But we have to depend on other part, which is the consumer side, to address this thing, and not just to look at the issue in a more isolated case.
Okay, Firdaos, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for breaking down the budget recalibration, and hope to see you again.
Sure.
Okay, now we're going for a short break. Woman charged with chopping off her husband's penis. Don't go away.